This is chapter 7 on page 158 with the Hulk over here. This case study is about hydraulic fracturing, which is also called fracking. Now we're going to talk about fracking in chapter 19, but this case study had a really good explanation, so I do want to cover it here as well. This chapter is mostly about environmental policy. So hydraulic fracturing happens all over the U.S. in many states. Some states have banned it, but it happens. Texas is the state where there is the most fracking happening. A lot of it happens in Dallas and the Fort Worth area, but it really happens all over because we have a couple of different shales where we can get oil and gas from. So it's usually natural gas. And natural gas is the cleanest fossil fuel, but it can also be petroleum. Usually if they have both in that shale, they'll try to get the natural gas because it's cleaner. So some positives about fracturing or fracking is that it keeps the price of natural gas low. If there's a large supply of a resource, then it's going to keep that price low. And then it also reduces coal use. Coal is the dirtiest fossil fuel, so using less of that is better. And then it employs people who work and who frack. And then it also gives money to landowners. So let's say there's somebody in West Texas a farmer, and a company can come in, a fracking company or oil company can come in and pay this landowner a lot of money to frack on their land, and so that's good for those landowners. Some negatives are that it is exempted from NEPA and the Safe Drinking Water Act, so they don't have to follow those regulations when they are fracking. NEPA is a act that says that companies who are extracting a resource have to fill out an environmental impact statement. And then chemicals and gas sometimes can end up in well water, which farmers use well water to drink and to use for their cropland. So sometimes chemicals, and we don't know what those chemicals are because they don't have to disclose them. Whenever they first started fracking in the 80s and 90s, they were exempt from these laws, so they don't have to follow these or disclose chemicals and what they're using. And then also the wastewater can be radioactive. It can cause earthquakes. Like in Oklahoma, earthquakes have risen, and they think it's because of fracking, because earthquakes don't naturally happen in Oklahoma. And so people think it's because of fracking, but fracking companies say, oh no, it's not because of fracking. So a lot of that happens. And then companies won't disclose the chemicals they use, so we don't have an idea of what may be polluting groundwater or well water. And so this figure right here is very important. Right here, this shows hydraulic fracturing really well. So go through and read what hydraulic fracturing is and what these steps are on that. Alright, on page 162, there's a tragedy of the commons. And that is the unregulated use of a resource that will lead to depletion. And usually it's in a common area, which is, it can be public area that many people or many companies can use. And so some examples of commons are rangelands. I wrote Wrangleland. It should be rangeland for cattle grazing, oceans for food, air, water, so air refers to air can be polluted, water like groundwater, aquifer water for drinking, forests for lumber, clean air because forests do filter and clean air, water and recreation. So if these areas are used and there are no regulations on how they should be used, then they can be depleted because no one has a claim to that. So they take it without thinking about the repercussions. And the solutions for depletion are regulations such as laws, quotas, and limits that are placed on these resources that are being extracted or the pollution that is happening. We're going to flip over to page 170. So know here, this is, so a couple of these paragraphs are talking about the waves of environmental policy in the United States. The first wave wasn't trying to set policy to encourage conservation and policy that they weren't trying to help the environment, but really conquer the environment, conquer nature. Some examples are they would encourage people to go out and to live in the West and mine and deforest so that people will go out there, use those resources. And it wasn't because they were trying to destroy the land, but people just didn't realize that those resources were finite. They thought they were infinite, they were vast. They didn't think that they would be running out of these resources. So they encouraged people to, you know, go out there, use them so that they could boost their economy. The second wave was all about conservation. National parks were formed, and this was around the time of industrialism, and reserves were formed. So this was really good. And then the third wave is the modern wave, the wave of now, and it was about addressing pollution, also in response to industrialism and the rise of fossil fuels, and also to protect species. So Rachel Carson, she's really famous environmental science. She wrote a book, Silent Spring, about pesticide use, the dangers, and specifically about DDT. So she was a part of this third wave. She kind of started this third wave that addressed pollution. So that was really good. On page 171, know the EPA is an agency, the Environmental Protection Agency, and know what it does in its role. So the EPA, it is not in charge of writing law or writing policies or making policies. That's Congress. The EPA takes those laws and regulations and it's in charge of enforcing them. So if there is not a law or regulation about the environment, they cannot do much. They cannot make it. They can only enforce it. So on the next page, we have these beautiful pictures of laws, and you do need to know most of these, not all. So I'll tell you what you need to know right here. You need to know the Clean Air Act, the Resource Conservation and Recovery Act, Endangered Species Act, Clean Water Act, Safe Drinking Water, and CERCLA. So the only two you don't need to know are these two, but we'll still talk about them in the year. You don't need to know dates, but you do need to know what the provisions are. So what does the law say about all of these right here? And we'll talk a lot more about these once we get to the units that they'll be more in depth later on when we get to specific units. So on page 178, know what a subsidy is, and a subsidy is money that the government gives a corporation, a company, or people, and it can be in the form of a tax break, tax credit, or a resource, and they can provide a resource for free. And it makes products artificially cheaper because those taxes are paying for that. And some examples are gasoline. So gasoline, if it wasn't provided with a subsidy, then we would have to pay a lot more for gas. Corn, wheat, and soy. So corn syrup, products that have corn syrup tend to be unhealthier, but they're also cheaper. So soda's a lot cheaper than it could be than how much it costs to actually make the product. So a lot of the so an issue that we have is that a lot of the world thinks of the U.S. as having high obesity rates, and we do, and that is partly because a lot of our cheaper food is subsidized and it's unhealthy. Also, coal, roads for logging. So some roads that are meant for firemen in national forests, companies can actually use those roads for logging. And then a positive subsidy is solar panels. California subsidizes their solar panels. So in environmental science, we call them photovoltaic cells. So this is really positive, and it makes these cheaper for the regular person to be able to buy. On page 179, the cap and trade system is technically it's marketable emissions permits, but we call them cap and trade. And so according to the Clean Air Act, companies can only use a certain can only pollute a certain ton out into the air per hour. So let's say a company is given 10 units of pollution, so that's how much they can pollute, but they only use 5 of those units. They can sell or trade with another company whose plant is dirtier. So if another company has already used their 10 units of pollution and they need more, they can buy these from that company. And this is good because it puts a cap on pollution, and it's there to curb pollution, curb greenhouse gases, carbon dioxide emissions. And that is it for chapter 17.